More than 3 decades ago, back when I was a much younger man, I helped a mate of mine move down to Glasgow from our home city of Newcastle. He'd managed to get a job as a football scout for Glasgow Rangers, which was basically his dream career. And so while me and all of our mates were sad to see the back of him, we were all really proud of him too. Now, we drove up early in the morning, and then once everything was unloaded, we had some pub grub and a few loggers, shandies for me, and then I started on the drive back to Newcastle. I'd left it quite late to drive back, so it was about midnight by the time I started to see signs for the English borders. The roads were quiet, with only the occasional lorry thundering past me, and I remember there being some phone-in thing on the radio, but I wasn't really listening. I was in my old Vauxhall Cavalier, an '82 model that I bought on the cheap about 4 years prior. It normally served me well, and it had been running fine all day, but just after passing a place called Jedburgh, the temperature warning light flicked on. I looked at my dash, watching the needle climbing into the red, and swore under my breath as I eased off the accelerator. Since it normally bought me a few minutes, I cranked the heater up full blast to try and pull some heat out of the engine. But that time, it seems my luck finally ran out, because just a minute or so later, there was this loud hiss from under the bonnet before steam started pouring out the seams. Seconds later, I heard this horrible metallic knocking sound coming from under the bonnet, and so I coasted over to the hard shoulder and then came to a stop just in time for the engine to seize up completely. And after that, aside from the ticking of my hazard lights and the sound of hot metal cooling down, there was nothing but silence for a few seconds, until I erupted. I remember shouting, "Are you effing kidding me?" a couple of times, and then, after taking a few deep breaths, I got out of the car and tried to fix it. And I tried it for half an hour, and in that time, a grand total of 2 cars passed me, but even with me waving at them as they passed, neither of them stopped. I didn't just stand there like some plonker for the whole 30 minutes, mind you. I popped my bonnet not long after getting out, but when I did, a load of steam and the smell of burnt coolant came wafting up into my face. And after waving away some of the steam, I spotted a crack in the top radiator hose and then noticed how loads of antifreeze was dripping onto the road and forming a big green puddle. I didn't have a spare hose, and neither did I have enough water to top it up properly, and even if I had, the engine had overheated so badly that I didn't trust it not to seize up again. Basically, I wasn't going anywhere in my old Vauxhall, and since there were no mobile phones back then, at least none for the likes of me, I had no choice but to walk if I wanted to get myself some help. Now, I reckon the nearest emergency phone would have been about a mile down the road, maybe more, and so I locked my car, left my hazards flashing, and then started walking along the dark grass verge with a torch in my hand. Now, I thought I'd be on the move for quite a while, but then no sooner had I started walking, I came to a dirt track, previously concealed by a long hedgerow, which led to what looked like a big 3-story farmer's house. Now, I was so happy that I was literally punching the air, because despite the fact that there were no lights switched on the ground floor, there was what looked to be candlelight in both the front-facing upstairs rooms. I felt bad for calling so late, but since the alternative of walking along the motorway was a much more dangerous one, I reckoned that I didn't have much choice. It was a particularly dark night, small moon and cloud cover, so it was only once I got closer to the house that I saw how run down it was. The ground floor windows were either cracked or newspapered over, and there were cracks in the wood too, along with a lot of peeling paint. And as you can imagine, I started to get really bad vibes from the place. But I try not to judge books by their cover too much, because you tend to be rewarded more times than you're burned for it. And so with that in mind, and granted very foolishly, I decided to knock on the door. I didn't knock too loud or aggressively. I didn't want to frighten anyone. But when my first knock got no answer, I knocked a little bit louder. Again, there was complete silence. No footsteps behind the door, no talking inside, nothing. But then after taking a step back and looking up at the top windows, I saw someone peeking out at me from behind a dirty-looking curtain. And I can't lie, it did scare me a bit seeing a pair of eyes staring back at me through the dim light. But as soon as I reacted, the eyes disappeared and I began to hear voices inside the house. Now, it sounded like a fair number of people, maybe half a dozen, and they were whispering like they were talking among themselves. I heard a little voice in my head saying, "They're awake, knock again." But before I could even dismiss it, I heard the sound of someone laughing inside the house. Not loudly though, more like a muted sort of wheeze as they tried to keep their voice low. The bad vibes that I was getting ramped up to 11, so instead of risking a confrontation with whoever was either living or more likely squatting there, I decided to make a move. I turned around and walked back up the dirt path as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me. Now, I was quite certain whoever was inside was watching me from those windows, but as long as they didn't follow me, then I didn't mind what they did. I'd almost gotten to the end of the path to where those two wooden gateposts held no gate when I started smelling something strong on the breeze, something that smelled like burning. And then when I turned the corner and could see out onto the road again, I felt this almost involuntary scream jump out of my mouth as I realized what the smell was. It was my car. My car was on fire. Now, I suppose I acted on complete instinct in running over to it because there was absolutely bugger all I could do about putting out that fire. All I could do was just stand there, effing and blinding and looking around for whoever might have done it. But as you can probably guess, there was no one, and the whole area looked deserted. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't. When I realized just how much of a bad situation I truly was in, I started jogging along the road until I got back on the motorway. Now, it was only a 4-lane carriageway, so I could walk along the verge without being in too much danger, but no matter how much danger passing cars posed to me, it still seemed safer than hanging around my burning car in that creepy house. Now, I think probably about a half an hour must have passed with only the odd car going past me, and in that time, I didn't try to get anyone's attention just in case it was the people from the home. I mean, the joke was on them in a sense because that poor cavalier was definitely on her way out, but on the off chance they wanted to do more than just burn my car, I had to be very careful about who I revealed myself to. Now, I was bloody nervous for that first half an hour, but after that, I started to calm down a wee bit. I hadn't seen any cars or anything parked outside the house, and if they really did want to chase me down for whatever reason, I reckoned that I'd have encountered them already. So once I calmed down a bit, and after maybe 2 or 3 more cars passed me with me sticking to the trees on the verge, I made my way to the edge of the road and then stuck my thumb out at what looked like a Land Rover of some kind coming my way. Now, it slowed down as the driver saw me, but then instead of switching on the light above the wheel, someone in the passenger seat started shining a torch in my face after lowering their window. And right away, I knew that wasn't promising behavior when I realized whoever was in the car didn't want to be seen, and I turned and started walking away. Now, a second later, I heard a very promising, "Need a lift, pal?" Now, one that was just friendly enough to slow me down and make me think that I might have been overreacting. But then the second I slowed, I turned back to face the car, and the passenger doors opened up and I heard someone shout, "Get him!" Now, I remember running right at the trees at the side of the road. Not along the road where the car would have been able to cut me off, but at and then through the trees and bushes at the side of the road. I remember closing my eyes as I felt things scratching against my face, and then when I opened them, I found that I'd come to a fence on the other side. I hopped over it with speed and power that I didn't even know I had in me. I mean, I was hardly some couch potato back then, but I wasn't exactly in perfect shape either. But I swear, I think I vaulted that fence like an Olympic athlete for fear of what might have happened if those men had caught up with me. It's strange thinking back on it as well, because these days, all I do sometimes is sit and wonder why those people chose to go after me like they did. But in the moment, as I was running, it didn't matter a jot to me. All I knew was that those people were out to get me, and all that mattered in the world was getting away from them in that moment. Now, I ran across this big dark field for what felt like ages, running and running until I couldn't anymore. And then when I got to the other side and spotted a road ahead of me, I swear I saw that same Land Rover driving along the road with someone shining a torch out into the field. I had to change my route and head off at an angle to avoid the Land Rover, and along with anyone to my rear who might have followed me. I had to force myself to run when I didn't think that I could run anymore, and Even though I was quite a fit young lad and one pumped full of adrenaline, I soon felt like that I was about to cough up a lung and fall over. In the end, I found myself staggering onto a road and then right back onto another dark field because I was too scared to be out in the open with a car full of blokes trying to find me. I kept on going like that until I came across a small town. And then as I was walking its dark and empty streets, looking for anyone who might be able to help, a police car appeared, and an officer asked what I was doing walking the streets alone like that. When I told him what had happened to me, he told me to jump in the car, and then off we went to the police station for a cup of hot tea and a few biscuits while I went into more detail about what had happened. As soon as I mentioned the house that I'd stopped by and mentioned how there had been people inside, I remember these two officers giving each other a look because they told me that the people inside must have been squatters. I thought that they might have been, partly because of how run down the house was, but the police confirmed that it was derelict and that there shouldn't have been anyone in there. They said that they'd head over and check it out, but they doubted anyone would be there. Squatters are kind of like rats. They're annoying and sometimes they're dangerous, but they're not stupid, and they just move on someplace else and then maybe return when things all blew over. But in all likelihood, they were gone from that house for good. I remember asking the two policemen why, as in why had they burned my car before trying to hunt me down like that, and the first words out of the policemen's mouths were, "Well, what did you see?" He was convinced that I'd seen them doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, and after spotting my car, which they assumed was still functional, they tried to make sure that I couldn't get away before chasing me down. But that was the thing. I hadn't seen anything, and once I'd established that, all we could think of was that those squatters just wanted to scare me off. One of the policemen said that since they didn't know who I was, they might have assumed that I was some kind of bailiff or law enforcement agent, and at first they might have been worried that I was a policeman, but then when they realized that I wasn't, they must have reckoned that I was fair game for a kicking. And if only to make sure that I was too scared to return. And with nothing else to say, I gave the police the phone number for my flat in Newcastle, and then since I literally lost everything but my wallet, one of them was kind enough to give me a lift to a nearby train station. It was long past dawn by then, so the trains were running, and I didn't have to wait long before I was on my way back to Newcastle. They phoned a few days later saying that that house was empty, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence tying anyone to the arson. They promised to keep their ears to the ground and would let me know immediately if there was any progress, but till then, they advised me to be patient because things like that took time. Sadly, that was the last I heard from the police, marking the end of my first encounter with squatters, and hopefully my last, too. I had no idea that those people could be so violent. I mean, call me naive, but the squatters I was familiar with were the hippies who took over empty houses in London in the 60s. I thought that they'd be more into peace protests and drum circles than chasing down strangers. But I suppose times had changed then, and people changed with them. Almost 10 years ago now, way back in September of 2016, I drove all the way from LA to Phoenix to visit an old high school friend. Now, I was 31 and female, but still Hispanic and still small, and I drove out on a Friday and we spent all day Saturday together. And then, even though I planned to drive back home in the mid-afternoon on Sunday, I didn't end up leaving until about 9 p.m. at night. Now I know, I should have left earlier, and I know what I'm about to tell you is basically my own damned fault for not sticking to my plan. But even so, there are still nights sometimes, even all this time later, when I find myself waking up from nightmares with a cold sweat forming on my chest, having relived it all over again in my sleep. It was just after midnight when I rolled into Riverside County after passing over the Arizona state line. Now, a few people were still up in that area, so it wasn't completely dead, but after I passed the airport and the Mesa Verde complex, the 10 got super quiet again, and it seemed like there was no one but me out there for miles and miles. I was just trying to keep myself awake with some music and by blasting some cold air when suddenly I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear view. Someone was coming up on me, and really fast too, and seeing how fast they were going, I honestly figured it was the police. I didn't panic or anything, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I didn't have anything in the car that I shouldn't have, and so I just sat tight, kept my speed, and let them get closer and closer. When they got so close their headlights were blinding me if I looked up into the rear view, I figured they'd pass and keep going. But they stayed put, right behind me in the same lane, and didn't budge for at least a couple of minutes. I'm trying to figure out if these guys really are cops, because it looked like they were driving in one of those big sliding door vans. Only this one was all blacked out, like even the windows looked like they were tinted. Now, there was nothing on it to say that they were police, and no lights on the top either, so I started getting really nervous thinking, what the hell do these guys want with me? Like I said, they stayed behind me like that for a couple of minutes, and then by the time they dropped back a little, they sped up to try and pass me, and I was actually super relieved. Now, I thought because they weren't trying to follow anymore, I was out of danger, when in reality, I was in more danger than I could have ever even imagined. I just let them pass, because what the heck was I going to do? But then instead of passing me and speeding off, the black van pulled back into the same lane as me and then started cruising maybe 10 to 15 minutes in front like it was trying to block me. I thought, oh, big deal, right? Like I could just slow down and lose them. But I didn't think that I'd need to, so I didn't. I stayed right where I was, slowing only a little to just a safe distance between us, and then kept on cruising just like the van was. Oh, I had no idea what they were up to, and I think maybe curiosity really did almost kill the cat here, because when the van's rear doors swung open, and I saw a man in leathers with some kind of bandana wrapped around his face, I kind of just froze up. I couldn't think of a single good reason why he'd want to open the back doors like that, and for a second I thought that he might be planning on jumping out for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking. All I did was lean on the brake a little and put just a little more feet between myself and that van. I just had no idea that I'd moved right where he wanted me. I dropped back a little more, still wondering what the hell these guys were doing and why they didn't have any plates on the back of their van. I then watched as the man with the bandana around his mouth began to smile at me. I obviously couldn't see his mouth, but I could see it in his eyes. That, or the dust was getting to him, because it's like he squinted before turning his back on me and carefully leaning down to grab something. Now, I might sound crazy or dumb to y'all who are reading this back in almost slow-mo, and maybe I was just too tired and slow or naive as heck, but I could not conceive of what he was about to do next, no matter how obvious it seems looking back on it. And so I just watched as the guy hauled something up into his arms, turned around, and then tossed it out onto the freeway in front of him. I saw what it was way too late, and I guess that moment of panic really did slow me down, but I had just enough in me to turn the wheel at just the right moment, so that when that old engine block came bouncing up off the blacktop, it smashed into my windshield on the passenger side and not into me. And once it hit, instinct told me to slam on the brakes, and so that's what I did, bringing my car to a spinning, screeching stop. Before I realized that I was covered in glass and there was basically a giant gaping hole where my windshield used to be. I just remember sitting there and shaking after I turned off my engine, and then I got out, walked to the side of the highway with my phone and dialed 911. And it wasn't until I described exactly what had happened as calmly as I could that I suddenly just broke down when the operator told me to stay on the line while she transferred me to someone. And after that, it was a case of guiding the cops and EMS to where I was so I could be taken to the ER. Aside from a few cuts and some mild whiplash, I was pretty much good to go, but I was reminded of just how lucky I'd been by that doctor. The cops had said the same thing, and that's why I say reminded, but at the time it didn't all the way feel lucky, and it wouldn't for quite some time. I knew I was lucky to be alive, and it wasn't like I was completely blind to how lucky I'd been in that respect, but all I could think about in the months afterwards was, why me? Like, why did they pick me of all the people they could have picked to throw a damn engine at? Like, I know they were trying to kill me. I just want to know what it was about me that made them think, yeah, this is the one. Let's turn her into hamburger meat. The cops didn't find that van or the people inside it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the boys in blue when I say this, but I didn't have much faith that they would. It was a black van, no plates, traveling in the middle of the damn night in the middle of the damn desert, and it might as well have been a ghost. And that fits too, because you know something? It sure as heck haunts me like one. More than 20 years ago now, back when my son James was still in elementary school, we took a trip down to Bethesda, Maryland from New York so he could see his grandma. Now, it was kind of messed up from the start, I guess, because I had something come up at work on the Friday we planned to leave. And this meant that I couldn't get on the road until about 8:30 in the evening, meaning I wouldn't arrive in Bethesda till after midnight at the latest. Now, I called ahead to my mom and made sure that was all okay, and she wasn't happy at having less time with her grandson, but there really wasn't much that could be done. And so after getting her to agree to stay up later than usual, me and James hit the road. About 2 hours into the journey, I stopped at a little gas station in Maryland when I realized I needed a coffee and a bite to eat. James was asleep in the back seat and I was worried about waking him up as I shut my car door, but he was still at that age where when he was out, and his eyes stayed closed after I shut the door. I got one of those big, super strong gas station coffees, a soda for James, and then a bag of those mini powdered donuts because I knew all that sugar would push me through the rest of the way. And then after walking back to my car, I found James was awake. And thinking that shutting my car door really had woken him up, I apologized and then turned in my seat to hand him his drink. And that's when I saw the key ring that he was now holding. At first glance, it looked like a little clown holding a sign of some description. And I asked him what it was while taking a look at it and saw how the clown's little sign read, "Flying Plow Circus." It wasn't plastic either, like it was mass-produced. It was wooden and looked almost handmade. And when I asked James where he got it, he said a man had given it to him. Now, naturally, this didn't ring any alarm bells at first, and I was about to just let it go. But then I asked when the man gave it to him, to which James replied, "A minute ago, while you were in the store." Again, this didn't scare me like it should have, because I'd locked my door. Now, I'd never leave my kid in an unlocked car like that while I went into a store, and since sleepy 6-year-olds aren't the most reliable and frequently play pretend, I didn't really take them seriously. But that's when James said something along the lines of, "Yeah, he did something funny to the door, like, then it opened, then he told us to go visit sometime." Now, I remember my pulse getting faster as I asked James if he was serious, and if he was sure. He told me he wasn't lying, and that the man used some kind of wire to open the door. Now, by the time he said that, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I asked what the guy looked like, and James just said, "Normal." And then as I got out of my car and looked around the parking lot, I don't think I'd ever been so close to a panic attack in my whole life. I tried to calm myself down as best I could, and then I asked James to tell me the whole story again from start to finish. He was starting to pick up on my vibes, so he was starting to get all confused and kind of upset, and I had to assure him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he just needed to tell me what happened, and then he went over it with me a second time. It made my skin crawl to think about, and it still does. The thought of some creep watching people, waiting for an opportunity to break into someone's car so they could creep on their kid. Like, I know all the guy did was give James a keyring, but that's his cover story, right? All he's doing is giving the kid a keyring till the parents take too long coming back, and then it's diddling or abduction time. I asked James if he said or did anything weird, or if he acted in a weird or creepy way, and James said the only weird thing he said was, "Your dad knows me." And even though he was 6, he was skeptical seeing that we didn't even live there. I was freaked out, y'all. The idea of what might have happened scared the hell out of me, but once I saw that there was no one around for me to blame, that fear turned to frustration and then straight up anger. I think if James had pointed someone out like that's him, I'd have straight up torched that dude, and I'd be writing this from prison or something. Not that a jury in their mother effing land would convict me of something like that, but you see my point. I told James to hand me the keyring, and then told him if anything like that ever happened again, he should yell for me, as loud as he could, and he wasn't to stop until I'd appeared to protect him. I told him he'd been very brave and he hadn't done anything wrong, and then gave him the speech on how not everyone who acts friendly wants to be friends. And then once all that was said and done and my heart rate had returned to normal, sort of, we got back on the road again. I remembered the name of the road that I was on a couple of minutes later because I looked it up later when I decided to call the cops. It was called Conowingo Road, a name I don't think I'll ever forget because I was driving down and I saw the sign saying Flying Plow Circus 1 mile ahead. I remember how the rage boiled up in me like you wouldn't believe, and I actually put my foot down thinking I'm going to give these a-holes a piece of my mind. I powered along the highway, probably dipping over the speed limit a couple of times till I finally found the sign saying Flying Plow Circus next right. I don't know exactly what I was planning. Maybe just find where the carnies' trailers were, then curse up a storm on how they needed to keep a leash on their pedo co-workers before he gets himself shot. I wasn't dumb enough to start a fight with a whole bunch of random circus folk, and I wasn't about to let their buddy get away with what he did either. But then after making the turn and driving down this dark dirt road to where a circle of trailers were sat, I changed my mind completely. If I could describe that collection of trailers in 2 words, those 2 words would be horror and movie. And there was a fire in the middle of them and a bunch of people gathered around it. And then when they saw my car, I saw a couple of them turn to look at me. I couldn't make much out. They were just these dark shapes with the fire in the background, but that made them even creepier looking. I realized that it might not be a case of one rogue carny, and for all I know, the whole gang might have sent that one guy out looking for a kid to snatch and bring back to them. Now I just kept on watching them, watching me for maybe half a minute more, and then after taking one look at James in the back, who by then had fallen back asleep, I thought, screw this, and then turned around and drove off. Now before James was born, if something like that happened where someone made me mad enough to hunt them down, then yeah, maybe I'd have gotten my car and been dumb enough to get my ass kicked by a dozen pissed off carnival folk. But after he was born, it was like I had this safety software installed onto my brain where everything I did sparked the thought of, how is this going to end for me? There was no point trying to defend him from something I wouldn't survive confronting, because being a parent is literally all about living to fight another day. Life's not a game anymore for me. I have to do everything I can to protect my kid, and it's just scary as hell when you try and do all the right things and still end up with some creep breaking into your car. I called the cops from my mom's place that next day after telling her all about the man, the key ring, and all the signs from the Flying Plow Circus. They called me back basically saying that they'd been stonewalled and that no one admitted to slipping out from their camp after dark, not even for a second. And that's what confirmed it for me. If they were just a bunch of innocent, good-natured carnies just making their way in the world, then I doubt that they'd have stonewalled a pair of cops who came around asking about a kitty creeper. If there was some sketchy loner on my crew and I thought that they were up to no good, and I mean really up to no good, I'd want them gone. So the fact that they all sort of said, "I don't know what you're talking about, officers," and that made me think that they were in on it and they were just covering for their boy. On the journey back from my mom's and while driving in daylight, I slowed near that turn that I'd seen the trailers on but didn't see any signs for the Flying Plow Circus. Now, I'm guessing that they moved on after the visit from the cops, and after looking it up, I don't think the whole Flying Plow thing was their regular name. Flying Plow something, I can't remember if it was a road or a lane or whatever, was the name of the place that they set up on, so wherever they went, they'd probably put up some new signs and under a new name, and then on they'd go. I don't even know if they were running an actual circus. I saw plenty of trailers, but no big top. But what I do know is that one of them went out looking for kids, and almost certainly for no good reason at all. My name's Hank. I'm a proud Texan, and I work as a bus driver taking folks all over this great state of ours. Most of those journeys take place during the day, but sometimes I like to earn a little extra pay by taking the overnight journeys, or what you might call the red-eyes. I fire up that big old rig around dusk, load her up with the sleepy travelers heading either home or away, and then take off along those long, lonely highways that stretch from Houston to El Paso and every place in between. I wouldn't call it a difficult job, but as long as you can keep the wheels turning through the witching hours and dodge all those back road deer, you can almost guarantee everybody gets where they're going safe and sound by sunup. And it's not often the bus causes you problems, because if you keep her clean and well-oiled, and she'll keep you moving and happy. It's the people that complicate things, though. Not every kind of person, but a certain kind, and all the worst rides have been down to that certain kind of person. Including this one, which was probably the worst I have ever experienced. Driving the bus across Texas at night with nothing but country songs and the stars to keep me company, it sometimes makes me feel like a night watchman, one charged with guarding the whole damn state. Now, I meet all kinds of interesting people on that open road under the big Texas sky, and then watching the sun rise over the prairies after a long shift, it's pure gold, but the cons hit hard too. Your sleep schedule gets all turned around, so whenever you're working nights, you miss out double on family dinners and weekends with the kids. The fatigue creeps up on you too, and dealing with rowdy passengers or breakdowns in the middle of nowhere is no picnic. But every so often, you get a special kind of rowdy. The kind that's not just drunk and loud or complaining about fellow passengers' body odor. The kind that's dangerous. Real dangerous. Back during the fall of 2007, I was on a run from Dallas to Austin, driving through the pitch black with nothing but tumbleweeds and truck stops for miles. I had this fella riding with me about 6 rows back, one that had been staring out the window and kind of muttering to himself, at least according to a fellow passenger anyway. I couldn't hear him at first, so it must have been nothing but a few grumbles and not enough to cause a scene. But then after maybe an hour on the road, I started hearing him as he started to raise his voice. I looked up into my mirror to see folks shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody said a word. That happens more often than not. People learn to tune out the oddballs on long bus rides like that, but the guy didn't get any quieter. He only got louder, and as he did, the tension in the air got thicker and thicker. My guy twisted something fierce knowing trouble was simmering, and I just prayed that it'd blow over, sort of like a false alarm, but it didn't. When it came, the guy went off like a firecracker on the 4th of July, almost like his fuse was sizzling away for a while, and then bang, off he went, and there was no stopping him. I heard someone say something to him, I guess a sort of shut up or something to that effect, and the guy replied with a full-throated roar, and then went at that challenger like a freaking skunk pig. I looked back for just a second to see him leaning across the center aisle, lunging at the person I assumed did the back-talking. I had to keep my eyes on the road, but I looked up into the mirror to see fists raining down, and then the sound of passengers screaming along with a doom, doom, doom of the big guy's fists against the other's face. They weren't fighting. It was like a beating. The kind that, if it wasn't stopped, was going to end in a casket and a family dressed in black. The bus exploded into chaos as the beating continued, with some people running for cover toward the rear and others charging the attacker to try and end the assault. And when he realized what was going on, the attacker sort of wheeled around and started swinging on the folks trying to stop him. And let me tell you, this man was no small specimen. From what I could tell, he made short work of the people trying to stop him, and I think he straight up knocked a guy out too, because something freed him up to go back to wailing on the first guy he attacked, who by then was out cold and leaking blood from his nose and mouth. I didn't get a picture of all of this until later, obviously, because I was mostly trying to keep my eyes on the road while keeping an eye on the situation behind me using my driver's mirror. But then as soon as I realized the violence wasn't about to stop anytime soon, I started slowing us down so I could pull us over and get as many people as possible off that bus. I didn't hit the brakes in a sort of screaming tires kind of way. You can't do that on the bus with people standing unless you want them falling head first. And while I didn't mind if our psycho attacker banged his head on an armrest, I had to consider the other passengers too. I brought the bus to the side of the road as fast as I could, which felt painfully slow given what was happening right behind me. And then once we'd come to a stop, I opened up the doors and began hollering for people to get out as quickly as they could. I think I herded about 12 to 14 people out of the front, and there were women clutching their children, a couple of old-timers who couldn't move as fast, but everyone else moved like greased lightning. Everyone except the people trapped on the back of the bus who were being blocked from the front exit by our raging psycho. We had an emergency exit at the back of the bus, so I started yelling at the people in the back to pull the lever and push the door open so they could all scramble out onto the road. I don't know if they just couldn't hear what I was saying over the sound of their screams, or they were too scared to turn their backs on that attacker, but they didn't do as I asked. I kept on yelling louder and louder, but then the psycho turned his attention to me and then came charging down the bus while roaring like some beast. I tried to put something between us, that something being the driver's seat, but as most of you can probably imagine, all he had to do was move a yard to the side and his fists had unfettered access to my face. I felt a couple of punches and kicks, but all I could do was try and shield my head in the hopes that he didn't do any serious damage. At one point, the guy actually grabbed one of my arms by the wrist and pulled it away so he could punch me right in the eye. All it took was one punch, and it felt like I couldn't see out of it anymore, and I knew it'd only take a couple of more of that to do some serious damage. The same pattern played out again, with people trying to get him off of me before being beaten back, and then he turned back to me and started all over again, but he didn't last long because maybe a second or two later all I heard was, "Hey, right here!" It was a young voice, almost sounded a bit like a kid's, and then bam, there was a gunshot, and then I heard that attacker start to groan. I looked around, the vision in my right eye still kind of cloudy, and I saw the attacker was curled up on the floor of the bus near the exit stairs, and he was clutching at his belly with a blood stain getting bigger and bigger on his shirt. Standing over him was this black kid with a gun. And I say kid as he must have been in his late teens, probably early 20s, but there he was, standing over the guy with a smoking pistol, telling him if he tried to get up, he'd blow his head off. With the attacker put down, and with all the fight having left him, the other passengers were able to get off the bus. People were treating the kid with the gun like he was some hero, but all he seemed interested in was getting out of there. I told him to hold his horses because the cops wouldn't arrest a man for defending people like he did. But he turned to me and, with a sort of scared look in his eye, he says, "It ain't legal. It ain't legal, man. I gotta go now." And then off he went. Lord knows where, and that's honestly the last I saw of him. With folks huddled outside in the cold, yes, Texas nights can get cold, I called in what had just happened on my cell and then waited with the rest while they either cried, hugged each other, or just stared into space like I did, wondering how the heck things all went so bad so fast. And not long after, we all saw lights flashing red and blue across the flatlands, and then as they got closer, they were joined by sirens. State troopers rolled up first. Their guns were drawn so they could secure the scene, and then I gave them the lowdown on that berserker. I mentioned the shooter too, and I know I should have been honest with him, and I might have been a little selective over what I remembered because God knows I didn't want that kid's good deed treated like a bad one. Once the cops had the scene secure, the EMTs came right behind them. They hauled off that unconscious fellow with his face all busted up and then stretchered off that young woman too, the one the attacker had given a few hard licks. And they even checked the attacker too, who was still alive but in a lot of pain, and then with him handcuffed to a stretcher, they took him away with a cop sitting in the back of the ambulance with him. The cops questioned everybody, taking statements while I stood there feeling like I'd aged a decade in about an hour. And the company I worked for got a replacement bus out to us as quickly as they could, and then once the dust settled and the authorities cleared us to go, we were back on the road again. We were minus a couple of passengers because some had chosen to wait for kin or friends so they could ride with them instead, but we were also +1 because I got to sit back and enjoy the ride with the new driver at the wheel. The atmosphere on the bus now was pretty dark, with folks whispering to each other about what had just happened. But I preferred the talk because, when it came, the silence was honestly heavier than a lead blanket. I still think about that kid sometimes, the one who shot our attacker before he could do any serious damage to me. I guess if you told me about a guy like that walking around with an illegal gun, I'd have assumed that he was the bad guy. And I guess he sort of was one of the bad guys if he was a felon or what have you. But then all it took was one pull of the trigger at that right moment, and he became kind of a hero to me. I know there's no such thing as a perfect person, but since that night, I've never been so convinced of the existence of flawed heroes. So I used to drive taxis in Liverpool back in the 80s. Now, it was great money for what it was, and so even though I only planned on doing it long enough to find a replacement for the job I'd lost, I ended up driving for almost 3 years before I finally gave up. A big appeal was that I could work when I wanted. If I had something that needed doing in the daytime, be it something with the kids' school or whatever, I could just take a few hours off, take care of business, and then head out on the jobs again at night to make up the hours. And there was no doing that in a factory or down on the docks, not without getting your pay docked anyway. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and I remember one particular job where for a minute or two, it didn't look like I was going to make it home to my family that night. It started when a job came through just after 10 p.m., asking me to take someone from Agberth Vale to Anfield. I got the address, drove over, and then parked up outside a small 2-up, 2-down on a dark and quiet street. I didn't want to beat my horn, which was the usual method of letting a customer know that we were outside, so I gave dispatch a buzz on my radio and asked them to call the customer back to let them know that I was waiting. Dispatch said no one picked up the phone, but then maybe a second or two later, I saw someone walking out of a house and towards my car. Now, as I said, it was dark, so even though I saw the shape of them moving towards the back passenger door, I didn't get a good look at them until they were sitting behind me, and when I did, I almost pissed my kecks. He was wearing a balaclava, and after he shut the door, he sank down low in the seat to make it harder for him to be seen from the outside. Now, he had what looked like a jerry can of petrol in one gloved hand, and then with the other, he pulled out what looked like an old detective gun from his jacket, like a proper six-shooter, and pointed it directly at me. He said if I tried to run, I'd be shot. In fact, if I did anything that even remotely upset him, I was a dead man. Now, my only job was to do what he said, and when he said it, and if I did, I'd go home alive that night. And so, seeing as I didn't have much of a choice, I drove where he told me to go. We ended up parked up across from a pub not far from the Rialto on Upper Parliament Street, I remember, and the lad in the back told me to turn off the engine and then spent the next 15 minutes or so checking his watch and peering up over the solid part of the door to watch the pub through the window. He kept on checking his watch, and I kept getting the urge to try and talk him out of whatever he was about to do. But every time the words were about to come out, something stopped them. I stayed quiet, and then noticed that when the clock on my dash hit 11 p.m., the lad in the back started getting even twitchier. When I noticed people coming out of the pub, obviously around kick-out time, the lad told me to start the engine. He was watching the pub doors like a hawk, and then suddenly, he started rolling down the window all frantically before he pointed the gun out the window, shouted something I couldn't make out, and pulled the trigger. One of the fellas who just walked out of the pub hit the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. Someone screamed, and then the guy in the back seat let out a scream of his own as he told me to drive. I obviously had to stay under the speed limit where possible, but it was tough with a gun pressed in the back of my head every so often, with its owner telling me that if I stopped for the police or took us down any dead ends, I'd be getting one to the back of the dome. The lad directed me to drive all the way out towards Speke to some of the derelict land near where the airport is today. He told me to get out of the car and then started emptying that can of petrol all over the seats after joining me outside. And that was the closest I had got to trying to do something when I realized that I was about to lose my car. I know that probably sounds horrible, seeing as I didn't do anything about him shooting that fella outside the pub, but I wasn't really in any position to do anything back then, whereas watching him pour that gasoline with his back to me, I knew that there was a very slim chance that I'd be able to get the drop on him. But if I didn't, I was a dead man. And so I basically talked myself out of it in my head and then watched as he set my car on fire and then ran off into the darkness. I just remember feeling numb. Less than an hour before, I hadn't even received the job yet, and then just a short while after parking outside that house to pick them up, my life had been changed forever. We obviously didn't have any phones back then, so I couldn't just call the police with a mobile like I would now. I had to walk all the way to a payphone, which took quite a while before I could contact the police, and only then could I give them any details. All I wanted to do was go home, get in the bath, and crack open one of the beers that I had waiting for me in the fridge. But the police wanted me to wait where I was so I could guide them to where my car had been dumped. It honestly didn't take all that long, and I'm grateful the police got out to me so fast, but the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back to where my car was still smoldering and repeat my story for a second time. But I had to, because the most important thing was making it really bloody clear that my part in the murder was an unwilling one, and I did that by giving them as much info as possible on the man that had done the shooting. But when they asked if I'd be willing to appear in a court at a later date, I told them no. Call me a coward, but to me, you'd have to be mental to testify against some gangster in this city. Maybe if I was in London or New York or somewhere like that, but not Liverpool, because everyone knows everyone round here. And they said that I might get asked again if murder detectives were put on the case and they found someone they wanted to charge. But the fact that I never got that call is the only proof that I need that they didn't catch anyone. I used to have nightmares about it too, proper horrible ones as well. But nowadays I just have these dreams. Not quite nightmares, but still clear enough for me to remember when I wake up in the morning. And sometimes in those dreams I do what I wanted to do in the moment and beg the killer to reconsider. But no matter what I say and no matter how I say it, he never, ever listens.